do not discourage anybody from doing so if you desire. So refer to me as Chair, Speaker, Gavin, or not at all, because there's really no need to refer to the Chair whatsoever in a speech. I'm going to go through the teams and take your names, the order in which you're speaking, and if you wish to give it your preferred gender pronoun. Starting with opening government.
Lauria, speaking first, preferred gender pronoun Sheila, they.
And second speaker.
Oh, Sivan, I don't know.
Opening opposition.
I'm Eloise, preferred gender pronoun she, they.
And William, preferred pronouns they.
Closing government.
My name is Shantanu, preferred pronoun he or they.
My name is Sakshi, preferred pronoun she or they.
Laura speaking first, she. Ellen, she or they.
Alright. Are there any questions about the motion or the standing orders before the debate starts? Excellent.
Sorry, I do not consent to be on the screen.
You don't consent to be on the
So
screen.
I think just me, that's okay. You can stream everyone else, that's okay.
Can
No
you
one be in the stream?
Yeah.
Okay, is it okay if I just turn off the video or do you want
Give me my
video
hand,
and
that's
all
okay,
that?
that's okay.
Hmm?
So you can stream everyone else, that's okay.
No, for you. I can turn off just the video, I can turn off just the audio or both. You choose.
Just the audio is okay.
Just the audio is okay? Okay, thanks. Just the audio.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. That will be the fifth speech of the round. Alright. In which case, I'm delighted to welcome the Prime Minister to open the debate on the motion that stands in her name. Here.
Has it? Who's timekeeping? Okay, wonderful. A very quick clarification. We're talking only about countries that do have a constitution and the status quo. Let's get this clear. So what do we think the issue is? We believe that today we live under law that was created by all outdated men that created constitutions hoping to ensure that their values remain the same regardless of the consequences they may be, regardless of the changing of the history, regardless of the changing of facts and the realities in which we live in. We believe that their values are outdated. We believe that their ways are irrelevant to the way we deal with issues today. We believe that their ideals are irrelevant and do not reflect what we believe in. What are we talking about? We talk about, for example, the Second Amendment in the United States that was given to ensure that the state is never stronger than the citizens, and it was given as a way to ensure that the state will never gain more power, specifically when the early United States was scared of Britain actually taking over it. We do not believe that this is the case today. But what is the actual horror of this happening in the status quo? Is that the result today is that you have many mass and school shootings, of which we hear every once in a while. When we hear Obama talk, we need to make sure that there are no firearms around, and nobody is able to say, well, you know what, the Constitution is irrelevant because we need to change it. We think that this is the very major issue. We believe that what we're proposing is that once every 25 years, which is mostly a generation, there's going to be a voting for a new constitution. What we're suggesting is there's going to be a discussion over a year prior to this, and the voting is going to happen 1 year before the re-election of the general office. This is how we hope to ensure that the politicians are going to be slightly less populistic. We believe not yet. And what we're going to suggest is we're going to open a website that is going to suggest all the topics that are going to be open for reconsideration, where people can actually open and file their ideas and debate these things for a year on all types of media and social media. What we're suggesting is talk about reevaluating things that we think about, like guns, values, refugees, and all of these things are going to be voted by the government and by the people that were elected and are going to be voted, and you will need a 60% vote of the ruling government in order for this to pass. Before I continue, any more clarifications? Yes? Yeah.
Information? Yeah.
So, information or clarification?
Information.
No. So I'm going to do a few things. First of all, I'm going to give you the comparative of where we actually have, a higher chance of actually following, more progressive and more liberal values. Secondly, I'm going to explain to you why we can do this. We can achieve these changes only through the Constitution, only through the changes through the Constitution. And thirdly, I'm going to explain to you why we're actually going to get more real, less populistic decisions, specifically through our mechanism. So let's have fun. So first of all, what is the actual comparative? We believe that we do not live in the same. We're not the same people. We don't live in the same times that actually were when the original constitution was created. Why is that? It's because when the constitution was written, it did not. The people who wrote the constitution did not have the same problems or were not aware of these problems. Let me remind you, for example, when the American Constitution was written down, a black person was considered, 3/5 of a white man. We do not believe that these assertions that actually guided the written constitution can be in any way applicable today. We believe that the people who wrote it were just unsure of the issues that exist. For example, gender issues. They're excluding current issues, for example, in immigrants, and talking about minorities and gender issues that we believe are really, really crucial today. And people were either not aware or these issues just did not exist just yet, not yet. And because we believe that now why do we need to have this to the Constitution? Because the Constitution is actually more respected. It's more comparative. It is more valid in the eyes of the people, right? Because what actually happens is when I know that there is just a law that can be just overthrown by a comparably small amount of people, I know that it's just a law and I respect it less. No. But when actually I know that there is a point that is constitutional, something that was made, voted for 25 or 15 years ago by a majority of the politicians that had to be in office, I understand it better. I'm more likely to accept it, or at least understand that the majority of the people actually believe in these values. The ideas that are actually going to be voted for are likely to be general principle, things to guide society by, and not just very specific rules as to which exclude. No. So why do we believe that we can do this only Constitution? Because we think the alternative is more or less going to the judicial system and letting the judicial system interpret in one way or in another some types of laws. Now we believe that the judicial system can only interpret the law. Whereas, where do we see a problem with that? We see that, for example, with the gay marriage in the United States, the High Court actually ruled in favor of gay marriage. But do you know what the problem with having just one rule and not a constitutional change is? That in the status quo, in many states in the United States, you actually are allowed to fire a person for being gay, regardless of the fact that they can get married in the same state. What actually this points to is that, the court can actually make only microscopic or very small changes that do not influence all of society, and it's very difficult to understand or to imply that or understand the implications of the change of law as opposed to the Constitution, where I understand that this is a generally guiding principle for most of society and not just for this specific issue. It means that we believe that when you change a constitution, you actually change more the course of history and more the understanding of the majority of people, and not just a specific case. Before I continue, I'll take seconds.
So you say that you want to get rid of the Second Amendment in the United States. Given the current political climate, a modern revision would strengthen gun rights.
Thank you very much. This is specifically my second point as to what type of decisions we're actually going to get. Because the opposition is telling us is that, oh no, they're all going to be terribly right-wing and want guns. So here's what we're actually going to explain. First of all, what the second opposition is saying is they're going generally against every single democratic voting system. People don't know what they want. They want terrible things. We don't want them voting generally. But the second thing is that, maybe there's going to be a generation that is going to be slightly less liberal, or just going to vote for maybe things that we today not agree with. But what the opposition has to prove is these things are generally morally bad, and that we cannot, and that they have a way of determining that, they're absolutely bad. But moreover, we believe that there are checks and balances, because we believe that even 60% of people actually have to vote for this. There is, in a sense, a way of making sure that you don't have terrible laws. And even if they are laws that we do not agree with today, we don't know they're bad. Secondly, we believe that if the majority of the people who want this is how democracy works, we stand for this. We beg you to propose.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Before we move on, a quick reminder that we should try to keep our voices down and comply with our foreigners, because some of it was a bit loud in that last speech. We now welcome leader of the opposition to here.
We found it particularly troubling with the opening government case that they wanted to make this whole debate about human rights, about making progressive changes, about helping minorities, because we think that they ignored a large part, or the most important part, of what constitutions are really about. Because we think that constitutions are first and foremost about setting up a structure of government for a country. It's about setting up like how parliaments work, how presidents are elected, how the Senate works, whatever works in your particular country. By making this debate about like helping progressive movements, about getting rid of the Second Amendment, about helping human rights, what happened with the opening government is they ignored the purpose of the Constitution and the stability that is needed to ensure the proper administration of these constitutions. So 3 issues in today's debate with rebuttal integrated. Firstly, what's the purpose of the Constitution? We're going to lay some groundwork here. But secondly, what changes in the process of reforming constitutions and how they're changed. And thirdly, what change will we get in the actual content of constitutions? So firstly, on what is the purpose of constitutions to start with? Because we think this is important to set up, to outline what we want to achieve in this debate. We think the purpose is how the first and foremost, to outline how the government operates and how it relates to the people. We think this, while some constitutions also include things like a list of rights or human rights, let's note that not all constitutions include these sort of things, such as the Australian one. So it's important to note that, first and foremost, it's about setting up how these things. We think it's fine that some constitutions do choose to have human rights. We're also going to explain why, this is better under our ways. The problem under the government model, when we have something that's been able to change every single generation, is that you no longer have the stability and the assuredness that how your government is going to run will be the same, and these problems I'm going to bring up now. So second issue, what changes in the process of creating constitutions? We think firstly, what the major change is going to be is there's going to be a lot more pressure to change constitutions unnecessarily. We think this comes from 2 main reasons. Firstly, from the public itself, from the debate that they wanted to start up every generation a year beforehand. There's pressure on politicians to change the constitution more regularly. But there's also political pressure from themselves, feeling some sorts of obligation to help protect their generation or do their duty for their generation by changing the constitution, because there's only this one sort of opportunity. Why is this bad? Because at the moment, there's lots of checks and balances on trying to change constitutions. Let's note that we can change constitutions at the moment, right? Constitutions are able to be modified through constitutional change a lot of the time. Amendments are repealed and added to constitutions. They're not set in stone. But what happens in this model is that there's lots of checks and balances, right? You need huge bipartisan support and the support of the public and that sort of thing. There's never any pressure or obligation just to change the constitution because that's the 30-year mark or whatever time frame we're looking at. It's because there's organic support for these sort of issues in society, and that it's the right time. But now, we think there becomes a duty to amend for the sort of generation. And this becomes partisan and politicizes constitutions, right? Suddenly, it's something that that politicians campaign on, right? There's generally, but we also think this will be not progressive like opening government tried to tell us, but generally quite conservative as well. We think there is often a status quo bias in terms of changing constitutions. That's for a few reasons. Firstly, we think that it's because having to get 60% change on these sort of 60% support for a constitution means that you're not going to get any radical change, but it's much more likely to lean the other way. But secondly, we think this is particularly harmful in the process of changing constitutions because it leads to sneaky changes. And what I mean by that is sort of changes that most people won't understand in the population because they're not bothered to read a 50-page document, but might change how votes are counted, or how the Republican but certain parties get money or funding or that sort of thing from the constitutions. We think this is particularly harmful when it changes the democratic nature of certain parties quite unfairly, and is solely a generational thing like that. What we heard from opening government was that this makes the constitution more valid. But the problem is that this was never particularly true, right? Because the example of trying to compare this to normal laws falls down, right? People always see the Constitution as more valid than normal laws because it's there for a much longer time period. It's been thought out a lot more. It's been much more set in stone. We think that's a particular problem. But even if this does make the Constitution more valid, right? Then this is a problem that's happening, right? Because it's going to stay not progressive. It's going to stay not deleting the Second Amendment. And then this is a problem that is seen as even more valid, but not acknowledging minority rights. I'll take opening.
Only when change is obligatory do people understand that outdated laws can be irrelevant.
Pardon?
Only when change is obligatory do people understand that outdated laws can be
No, so we think it's the
irrelevant.
opposite, right? So because so we think that the problem is that people won't realize that outdated laws are relevant and that we'll have actually the opposite problem where societies aren't ready for outdated laws. If you take the example of Roe and Wade in the Supreme Court, when the Supreme Court allowed abortion laws a lot earlier than the Parliament was ever willing to do that, right? The problem is that this then stifled discourse and actual change and actual helpful change on abortion laws. And many people have agreed that abortion laws would have progressed a lot further if we hadn't changed too early. My point here is that by doing it every generation and feeling you need some change, even if there is mildly progressive change, what will happen is that people won't be ready for it and will get bad discourse. So thirdly, and this is linking into what I was just saying, how does it change the content of constitutions? So we think that what the opening government wanted to talk to us about is that we'll get more progressive values and help minorities more. But we think firstly that this isn't the most relevant factor of constitutions, because all constitutions, first and foremost, the most important thing is about administration, because some don't have rights. We think that's all right. But also that there are other parts, the more minority rights, progressive rights, are easier to change through things like the Supreme Court interpretations or through changes like that. But secondly, we think the model won't solve the problem because there's still a status quo bias that's very difficult to pass. Parliament's still dominated by white men in most places, that we won't get any of this progressive change they wanted, but just flimsy change on the administrative side. And that's why we're very proud to oppose.
Thank you, Leader Ron. This is not just a long playing record, but people are still being too loud, so whisper right now or I will call order on you. With that, and a more cheerful smile, welcome Deputy Prime Minister here.
So part of the basic of the most primary attack that we got from OO is that, you know what, we don't think that you have to be liberal in order to promote this constitution. Well, my partner told you is that not only do we think that human rights are basic and will probably stay in every country, but we think if you know what, we don't have to have liberal values. What we do have to have is a true and real discourse about what kind of a society we want to shape as a nation. What kind of values, what kind of beliefs we need to have, and this is something that notice and that we have to have to think about every generation, because we change, because the situation, the problems, the things that we have to face with every decade or two are changing. Terrorism issue, migrants, gay issue, all of those issues are things that, you know what, we didn't have to deal with 50 or 60 years ago. Now we're actually enabling our society to stop and think, you know what, maybe we don't have to be chained to old habits, to old beliefs. Maybe now we can actually choose for ourselves and make the country a better country for us. I'm going to have 3 points of rebuttal, and then I'm going to just explain to you how this discourse will actually happen, and now we're allowing the citizens to shape their own values. Let's start with quite a lot of rebuttal. So we heard that the purpose of the Constitution is basically to allow, well, everything to stay as it is, and to make sure that the system of governance is the one that remains the same. So we don't think that the system of how you choose parties will change, because we think that most citizens are regular to a certain system. We saw that in Canada when they tried to change the system, it didn't really work. They tried 5 other options. They started a committee, it cost them millions after years and years of trying to find a better system because their system is
problematic, then they decided, you know what, the system that we have is probably the best that we have after like discussing it with the public. So we think that the public probably won't want to change this, the system itself. What we are talking about, what the Constitution is basically for, it's basically a manifest of values and beliefs. It's a line that guides the state, it guides the citizens. Why? Because we think that courts interpret their laws, their values upon that Constitution, right? Because when you are talking about what kind of future you want to shape, not just by the Constitution, but also politicians who propose laws, who propose policies, address the Constitution as a guiding line. And we think that once you're talking about citizens, like what I believe in as a nation, as a state, you go to the Constitution because it reflects the things that you believe. For example, in the Constitution of the United States, you see a lot more emphasis on freedom, right? On the need to restrain the government, because when they voted, they were so afraid of the Brits, and they were also so afraid of people and gaining more power to go against, that the state will be much more powerful than the citizen and will abuse its power. In other countries, you see much more of an emphasis on minorities, because those were the issues that actually were interesting or were relevant at that time. So we think that every country has the institution that actually reflects the beliefs and values and the problems that they had to face at that time. But we are telling you, and what my partner told you, is that Constitution was never meant to be bulletproof. And the problems that we have today is that we don't, and that is that we can't change them. And so we have laws that are irrelevant, that are all dated, that are actually going against what the public wants, what the people want, but we are too tied down. Second point of rebuttal is that we heard that now there will be a pressure to change the Constitution and nobody wants. A, we don't see why this will happen. If something works, then they'll probably keep it. If not, then we'll discuss it. But second of all, notice that all said themselves that if you need 60% and a majority of bipartisan, then it's going to be very hard to change it. Then you know what? Probably it won't be about the small issues, it will only be about the big issues, the thing that define us as a state. The gun amendment is something that defines you as a state. Gay rights or freedom of religion and from religion is something that defines you as a state. That are the guided moral lines of you as a society, and we don't think that this will be about, you know what, whether you should tax 20% of the rich or something like that. Third point, and you know what, third answer to that is that we heard that, well, we have amendment, that's enough. A, according to their own analysis, they said that just a simple law is not as valid because you know that there's something stronger, right? They said that in themselves, and we think that the same logic applies. When you have a constitution, you tend to take that more, you tend to address that much more as a citizen. And you know what? More often than that, we think that you are restricted by the courts. Even if you interpret and give it an amendment, you can only do so much. You have a very small leeway that you can actually change things. You can't really change the whole assumption. As my partner told you in the example about gay marriage in the United States, you can't really change perception of people when you don't have the guiding line saying, you know what, we think that gay are okay and we need to give them all of the rights. And thirdly, before I'll take a POI, they told us that abortion have changed through courts. Abortion wasn't anti-constitutional. We think that this is exactly the laws that won't be discussed because we have courts that can decide that, but rather and opposed to values that can and need to be discussed and are banned by the Constitution. Before I go on, first,
Ireland recently voted to change their constitution to allow gay marriage. Constitutional change already happens, it's just organic so that it's what people actually want. How will your change be any better?
Again, we don't have in the United States a chance to actually evaluate that because the courts have decided, and you don't have in the Constitution something against gay marriage, right? But in countries like Uganda, in countries that actually ban gay marriage because they see those people as actually criminals, this is the type of thing that we need to consider. This is the kind of discussion that we need to have in society, and we don't have it today because the Constitution prohibits that, because courts can't go against the state, because they are limited, because they are being chosen by the state, because courts are being supervised by them, and so they can only do so much. Now, I won't get to my last point, but it was in the rebuttal. We are talking about real discussion because the citizens do take the Constitution as a guided line. Therefore, when we have a discussion where people actually have the platform to express their ideas, to express their belief, especially notice when we are talking about a year before the election, you'll actually have politicians politicians listening, which is something that's very different from the status quo, right? Because now you know that they'll have to listen to what the public wants and what they want to reflect and change for the future generation. Today, we are extremely proud to propose.
Thank you, Deputy Prime Minister. We now welcome Deputy Leader of Opposition to here.
For a team that wanted to stand behind calling a constitution the will of the people, it was bizarre for the same team to say we want constitutions to talk about minority rights. Because America was never going to vote in favour of gay marriage for 2/3 of the population which was needed, or 60% or whatever their model was, that was needed to change the constitution. The problem was, now the constitution was viewed as the will of the people, and the will of the people said no. What constitutions do is entrench norms about majoritarian rule. It tells minorities that they are worthless in society, but more importantly, that the population doesn't support their rights. In this debate, what we preferred was keeping minority rights to the judiciary or regular parliament, not by saying it was the will of the people, because it entrenched ideas about being gay is not right, and entrenched ideas that the majority was right where it was. We thought the constitution should be kept for the structure of the government, which is what they were. Minority rights should be dealt with elsewhere. Two things in this speech. One, how does this change the process of changing constitutions, making it easier, and why is that bad? And secondly, does this actually make things better for minorities? Does it change the constitution in substantive? Very briefly before I do, I want to talk about what the comparative in this debate has been so far. What we support on opening opposition are three things. Firstly, keep the constitution generally for governmental change. It's going to be the structure of the government, the ways in which public votes are conducted, or the ways in which constitutional reviews happen. We would much prefer that to say, and we can take it still different to changes on human rights. That would rather happen interpreting the constitution in the courts like that happens in the United States. Very happy to keep Obergefell and Hodges, like what happened in the gay marriage case in America, as it did. But we would say that we'd rather change all of those substantive things about the constitution in terms of rights to the courts, because they're much more responsive than constitutional commissions would ever be. So, two things. Let's start on process. The first thing I want to talk about is we suggested from opening opposition that it is going to become much easier to change the constitution, and much from more unnecessary things. Because what happens is now that the population expects change of their politicians. Because now this becomes a duty of the politicians of the day to change their constitution. Because in 25 years' time, when a new government is elected, and they know in their tenure they're going to have to change the constitution, they are elected on promises in which they will change the constitution too, right? Because if a Conservative Party knows in 3 years' time, during the government, they're going to change the constitution, it's very likely in their political campaigns they will promise they will change X, Y, Z about the constitution, or try and raise these issues. Why is this bad? One, we think it delegitimizes the value of a constitution in the first place. A lot of people consider constitutional changes very skeptical, will probably consider these more skeptical if it's happening more frequently. But secondly, it makes people much more used to the process of changing the constitution. Why do we think this is necessarily bad? Firstly, politicians have hideously perverse incentives to change the constitution. One, people know very little about the constitutions of those countries. I'd invite opening government to tell us what is in their constitution. I would probably guess they didn't know, because we didn't know either. But secondly, we would say there are massive political incentives to change smaller administrative things, like changing the vote for constitutional change to 50-50, which seemingly sounds like a good idea to people and can easily be mobilized by popular rhetoric, but are actually terrible ideas. But more importantly, thirdly, governments of the day are a powerful normative force to tell people what is important. Because when a government of the day tells people that it makes things largely more administratively easy, and we're getting rid of red tape by cutting down the restrictions on government, it's very easy to pass sneaky changes by the wording of that constitutional change. We think that's generally bad. Second thing under this issue, we think it changes the debate away from a substantive one to a partisan one. For reasons I've already given, we think it's probably likely it's going to be analogous to Supreme Court nominations in the US, rights. Right now, they're accepted as largely partisan. The government of the day, when one is no longer elected, now gets to choose which one they would most like to have. We think it's probably going to be analogous to constitutional change. It is a generational thing, rather than something that needs a lot of public and groundswell support in the first instance. What we think is much, much better is having lots of debate about a single issue, rather than forcing debate on people. We don't think that all discourse is necessarily good, but when there is a constitutional change that is necessary and wanted by the people, it is not because they are forced to change something, which we think governments will become incumbent upon themselves, but they will want to change it, and we think that's much better. I'll take a point of information from opening.
A, you can still have the changes of law through the judicial system. B, even if majority votes against minorities, no change, it's now different from the status quo. And even if the decision is populistic, it's fine because we want what the majority wants.
No. So there's a couple of reasons. I'm going to address how this makes it worse for minorities right now. The first thing we're going to talk about is how this makes it mutually exclusive for minorities. Right now, minorities aren't expected to use constitutional changes to change their human rights. Under your side, though, you guys tell minorities to change to get gay marriage in the US, you have to pass a constitutional amendment. We think that's terrible because we think it's probably likely to fail. 3 reasons why. 1, majority rule. The overwhelming population of America does not support liberal rights. The fact that Donald Trump is polling at 40% right now and is literally proposing to deport all Muslims in the country probably means that minority rights aren't supported. So you guys don't get the gay marriage that you guys talk for 8 minutes about. Secondly, there is a status quo bias, which means that people are much more likely to support things that are already existing, because political rhetoric is easy to say, let's not change what isn't broken. So it's probably more likely under your side for things not to change. Thirdly, it's very easy for politicians to use tricky wording or other legislative changes to make those harder to do. We would much rather for these to happen under the judiciary only, that the norms are about changing them legally in courtrooms or changing them by parliament vote, which is much easier to pass for minorities, rather than making them go through the constitutional battle, which is much, much more difficult for them. The third thing I want to focus on here is all of their stuff on discourse. They said that almost all discourse is good. We think this is not necessarily true. 1, in Ireland, the vote around gay marriage brought to prominence a lot of homophobia that was incredibly damaging, because what happens to the debate now is it seems there's 2 legitimate sides to that debate. We don't think that's necessarily true. When it's kept to a courtroom, it is on legal issues. When it's kept to a public vote, we think that people are now voting on the rights of minorities and that both sides are seen as legitimate. That means that homophobic people are now seen as a legitimate actor in this debate. For all of the gay, we saw that in Ireland's vote, the rise in anti-gay hate crimes rose during the time of the constitutional debate, because people saw that homophobia was more easily able to be presented as professional and legitimate and an alternative opinion to what people are talking about. It's much better to keep these to parliamentarians or judiciary rather than to people who can mobilise homophobic abuse. We think that's worse. The 5th thing I want to talk about here is that we think that when under your side, when constitutional changes are done by the government of the day, they're seen as less legitimate than under our side. Given under our side, they are quite rare. Under yours, when they're much more frequent, people give the Constitution less weight than it would otherwise. And that's incredibly bad, because backlash is more likely to occur. Because when Conservatives now see the Second Amendment going away after being here for 250 years, they're less likely to treat the Constitution as anything important. They're likely to feel disillusioned by the government of the day and less likely to actually consider the issues in the debate. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a terrible idea because it makes constitutional change much easier for administrative things that are easy to sell but terrible for governments. But more importantly, if they want to stand behind minorities, they shouldn't stand behind more homophobic abuse or bad discourse or making the Constitution much more difficult to change minorities. We're very happy to oppose.
Thank you, Deputy Member of Opposition. I've been informed there is no commercial break for this show, so we'll move straight on to the Member of Government here.
Excuse me. Hi. I changed my mind. Can you cut the audio as well, please? Thank you. Thank you.
legitimate for people to have a say in defining what the state means to them. We think it increases national cohesion. For all these reasons, extremely proud to propose.
Thank you, Member of Parliament. We now welcome Member of Opposition to give
I'm fine with having the recording turned back on, if you like. Alright, is everybody good? Alright. Thank you so much. Ellen and I love talking about constitutions. We're really enjoying this motion. I want to talk first about the purpose of democracy, which I think that we've heard a lot of good things out of opening half, but I think that there's a lot of nuance that can be added. And then I'm going to go into two areas of constructive material. Rebuttal is going to be interspersed. So we tell you that the purpose of democracy is to create a government that is reflective of the people while respecting and protecting the rights of minority groups from tyranny of the majority. And I think that that is something that has been kind of missing from the advocacy that we've gotten so far out of the Gov bench. Well, they've talked about why we need to respect the will of the people, but haven't shown mechanisms within their system that can protect people from the tyranny of the majority, given the way that the democracy works, and given the reactionary way that people tend to feel about rights as they view them in certain contexts. So how do we get actual progress on rights protection, and how can we do this? Because I think that we got really good analysis out of opening up on all of the reasons that this would be problematic for the function and structure of government itself. And what we're going to do for you on closing up is give you all of this analysis about rights protection and tyranny of the majority. So first, you need firm principles with new applications. You need to have like standing pillars of reason within your society, and rights that are respected over time is something that we ought to enshrine. And then you need to be able to have new applications of those, and that is where the court system comes in. And you also have to have productive discourse. So in order to be effective, rights need to be broad for them to be able to stand over a long term, to be applied to multiple different situations and things like this. And what's important about this is that the majority would often choose to suppress individual rights of given groups, of given minorities, but they would want to have those own rights for themselves, right? That is why people are willing to vote, for instance, for an amendment to say that we all want free speech, but if it came to a vote in a situation where there's a certain group that we would like to suppress, we would vote against that amendment. What's important about that is that when you're constantly changing the rights that you're protecting, the rights that people want to protect will change situationally. That is, in the United States, for example, historically protecting freedom of religion has been extremely important, and it has been enshrined as a right that we ought to protect. But right now there's a very strong movement against freedom of religion because of anti-Islamic sentiments. That means that on their side, if it were to come to a vote right now, people would de-strengthen the right to freedom of religion because of the sentiments that they have right now, because of the fear that they have right now. Even though in other applications they would not want that to happen. The problem with that is that you lose all of the really strong and broad rights that you need to be able to have so that you can apply them. They say that having these applications of the court are not as good. Recognize, though, that when you're not going to be able to get the amendments that they say that you should want, that you should be getting, it's necessary for you to have the courts to do them. And you don't have to be constantly adding new rights to the Constitution in order to be able to get new rights brought to you through the court. For instance, in the United States, you just need one equal rights amendment to be able to do things like have Brown versus Board of Education, which desegregated schools, which meant that black children and white children had access to the exact same education. If you tried to pass an amendment that said black children and white children should be able to go to the same schools, it would not have passed. But because you could pass an equal rights amendment, then you're able to actually give those rights to children. Similarly, there's no way even now that you would be able to pass an amendment allowing people to have access to abortion. In fact, people are trying to do the opposite and pass an amendment that says that we should define right as beginning, life as beginning at conception, which is something that actually might pass on their side of the house. Whereas when we have an enshrined right to privacy, that is something that the courts are then able to use, even though it's hundreds of years old, and we're able to use that to protect women's rights to privacy of the medical decisions, and you have a decision like Roe v. Wade. I'll take opening.
Given that the world progresses with liberal values, tell me how in your world abortion would now be cancelled versus our world in which we actually want to give the Constitution the ability to change perception and values of the people.
Sure, so you want to be able to change the values, but you're not actually changing any of the values, right? Like, all that you're doing is allowing people to use their most reactionary instincts in order to change the rights that we enshrine within society. We're not saying that we shouldn't respect the values that people have, but rather we're saying that the values that they have should be ones that we maintain over a long period of time and are broad and able to be applied in a way that actually protects everyone equally, which is not something that you get given the way that democracy works in the reactionary nature that people have. So what's problematic is that that current context is always going to be changing, and there will be a certain context that you're in each instance in which these things come back up for a vote. This is particularly problematic when you have instances where people feel under certain threat and then feel like they need to take away certain rights, which is something that is constantly happening and something people constantly try to do. It is the courts that usually are the ones that are preventing that. Secondly, let's talk about how we actually get good discourse. And I think that this is something that Gov wanted when they talk about how it's important for us to have these changes so people will recognize it and they'll see it in the Constitution. What they don't seem to get, though, is that in order to have the kind of discourse that you want, you need to allow movements to develop and grow organically. We need to have the things that they want to be discussed at their height. So even if you think that it's possible to pass some of these amendments that they want to, like say pass an amendment that says that marriage should be can be between people of any genders, like the one that we had in Ireland, if they say they want one in the United States, you need to allow that change to happen at the organic height of the movement for it to have any chance of passing. You're not going to be able to build the political capital to make every change that might be necessary within a generation all at one time. For one thing, because it's just not politically feasible to have that progression happen, but also because it's literally not possible to have adequate discussion of all of those things at one time and actually be able to have in-depth analysis. This is where what opening told you about having sneaky amendments go through is actually a really meaningful problem, right? Because nobody's going to be able to read all of the little changes that you might make, or perhaps know all of the possible readings of that amendment if you're looking at so many at once, whereas if you have very close scrutiny because you're doing one at a time, when there's actually the political will to discuss that, you're less likely to have the kinds of really problematic changes that you might have. But also when you do it on this generational basis, you have the potential to get all kinds of manipulation from outside sources that will just manipulate the democratic will and won't give them the results that they want anyway. You have ads and lobbying and pressure from religious organizations and things like that will all come down at this exact one time, meaning that all of the organic discourse that a movement could create through grassroots kinds of things will just be drowned out by super PAC ads about abortion or about gay rights and things like that will just kill the amendments that they want to have on their side of the house. Finally, though, what's problematic is that when they have this kind of process, people are always going to feel like their rights are under threat. So there's no promise that they'll have the rights that they've been promised right now. You can look to the fact that when Barack Obama got elected, even though he had said nothing yet about gun rights, tons of people went out and bought out all of the guns at stores because they were so afraid that the Second Amendment was going to go away just because Barack Obama got elected. Imagine what's going to happen when you have this thing going on, and then people, when they feel personally under threat, are going to become more conservative and more unwilling to recognize the rights of others and just be more paranoid about their own rights and not to want to have the progressive changes that SideGov wants. So proud.
Thank you, Member of Opposition. We now welcome Government Whip. Here.
First thing we need to understand this debate is that these things are going to happen generationally. So the exaggeration of the effects that we are hearing from opposition, that minorities will be oppressed, that there's going to be a referendum every year, that every time a Supreme Court wants to decide something, everybody's going to have a say, are greatly exaggerated. Yeah. What I'm going to first start out with is rebutting CG, and I'm going to go into talking about bringing back extension, why we think it is legitimate for the state to do this, and then talking about things like legitimacy and national identity, and lastly I'll be dealing with some of the stuff we heard from opening opposition. We've heard from closing government, and this is running theme from opening from opening opposition as well, then minorities will be oppressed. We think that this is incredibly unlikely to happen because we think that the Supreme Court is still able to pass laws like Roe v. Wade, like making amendments and allowing for gay rights to exist and allowing people to marry. Because we don't think we're abolishing the Supreme Court. We don't think that every time the Supreme Court says we're going to do a thing, people are going to clamor to it and have a say for it. We think that the Supreme Court still acts a check and balance against the tyranny of the majority, if it is a tyranny of the majority. We think that, so therefore, if people at a particular time are conservative and the Supreme Court is therefore acting against that and making progressive laws, these things can still happen. The difference is that now, the difference is that 25 years later, people get to have a say on those things. So we think insofar as progressive laws are concerned, people often liberalize with time. There's a certain legitimacy attached to the Constitution. The idea attached to the Constitution. The more gay people marry, the more women have a right to abortion. The more the more legitimacy that kind of thing has. And as people liberalize with time, they're okay with these laws. The second thing we want to say is that we think is that minorities often don't have a say within the legislation. Right? My extension members told you that countries are often becoming more and more culturally diverse. In America, for example, more than 40% of the population will be Hispanic by the time you hit 2020. It is not applicable for them to be ruled by a constitution created by white forefathers. We think it's perfectly legitimate for that immigrant population to then have a say in the constitution, in the core sets and values that ultimately govern them. Here's where we talk, even if we set back progressive laws, I'm going to later talk about why we think this principally just. The next thing to say is that Supreme Courts don't always pass progressive laws. We think they've forgotten about that. It is often the case that the laws such as gun laws that are anti-progressive that people actually want. Right? They make the mistake of saying that everybody is conservative, everybody wants guns. But if you look at the recent congressional debate that happened, you could see that the reason why a ban on gun laws was not passed was because of NRA lobbying and not because that is what people wanted. You could poll news services, poll individuals later afterward, and many of them disagreed with what the Congress had done. So you see that those kind of influences are then mitigated. So we think on the comparative, they greatly exaggerate the harm. The next thing that they then talked about was people cannot read it. You can pass sneaky laws and things of that nature. We think we are happy to have an independent committee that then comes in and makes it a non-partisan issue and makes the Constitution something that people can vote on. That different political parties don't have a say in influencing. Sure, that political parties can go ahead and promise votes, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the discourse around that necessarily has to be partisan. If you have independent committees that come in and rule discourse over that. I will then later on. I'll talk about why we think then this is legitimate. We think that everybody in this debate has kind of missed the idea of what a constitution is. It is not, as opening opposition says, a system of governance in and of itself. It's not a technical document that says this is a Congress, this is how many technical votes you need to get to pass laws. It is at its core a document that defines core beliefs and values that a country espouses. It is a document that tells you and tells the world what you stand for, things like freedom of speech or equality, etc. It therefore encompasses the most fundamental and therefore most far-reaching ideals that a state espouses. Therefore, it is in the right of a generation to define what things they believe in. Why do we think that this must be decided generationally, specifically? Because firstly, we think that the most fundamental change in ideals and beliefs of people happen generationally. It doesn't happen every 4 years when you elect a new government. The change in identity, the things we believe in, often happen generationally because that is the time in the world has changed, when the world political issues have changed and technological change has occurred. The second thing we then think is the reason why it must happen generationally is because we actually think it actually allows for progressive change, where people become acclimatized, where people over years become more liberalized. Because we think that insofar as history is concerned, we see that people often do. We see that the majority often moves towards the more liberal side, especially in culture. culturally diverse countries, and we therefore think that they then should have a right to say that the Constitution should reflect those values. It shouldn't be then passed by, it shouldn't then have to be by Congress that is always up for review 4 years later, that it should be passed by the Constitution and should be something that the next generation inhabits because they think it is better for the stability of that generation to value minorities. But before I move on, yes, opening up.
When you make constitutions contain substantive rights and more frequent to change, you create norms that rights must be changed in that way, which is very difficult to do. Why not keep constitutions limiting governmental power, which is hard to do, rather than making it difficult to change minority rights and using the courts, which are much easier for minorities?
We think if you're all about using courts to change rights, we think if you're all about using courts for changing rights of minorities, we're happy to do that as well, right? We think that the Supreme Court already acts on that basis within status quo. We've already told you why it's legitimate for 25 years later for that generation to have a say in what those in how those rights should be. We don't think that norm is necessarily bad insofar as that norm allows people to be engaged in that discourse, right? Because insofar as you're trying to create a national identity, we think that national identity is revolved around things like what you believe in, what you stand up for, what your nation stands up for, and what the nation should collectively believe in. We don't think that the discourse happens unless you have a say in it. We think that in status quo, cultural populations that are often news, for example, immigrants or gays who just recently come out, we think that they often feel disenfranchised within the current system because they don't think either that the change is happening fast enough, something that they can have a say in the next time the Constitution is up for review, or they don't think that they're part of the political process. So if you make the norm that things have to change, you make it the norm that people have to be involved within this discourse. Something we think is particularly great. We also think that this ultimately helps enfranchise individuals to be more part of the decision making process when it comes to constitutions, and it helps them decide and become part of that process. For all these reasons, very proud to propose.
We thank the Governor Whip, and now welcome to conclude the debate and this evening's performance. Opposition Whip, here.
Everybody good? Okay. As a member of Boston University, I enjoyed this round about mainly the U.S. Constitution. So I'm going to talk to you about who best reflects the values of democracy, also how does a society liberalize over time, seeing as how that became a very important point in the round, and finally, how this type of liberal change is actually enacted. So first of all, we talk about who best reflects the values of democracy, and up and down government bench, right, they talk a lot about democracy being completely representative, but the problem is, when they're talking about these minorities being really important, when they're talking about actually representing all of the people, they and especially as my partner points out, right, they can't actually interact with the fact that the tyranny of majority is really important in these democratic values, and they can't actually deal with that on their side of the house when they literally just have the majority, as opening up starts to tell you, and my partner gives more analysis on, they can't deal with the fact that the majority is just going to enact the type of policies that they actually want to have happen and completely ignore these minority values, these minority rights. On their side of the house, this is just exacerbated and actually affirms the ideas and the hegemonic norms that are already in play that are particularly problematic, right? You can look to the example that we talked about when we talk about the fact that things like freedom of religion are then going to be infringed on even more, right? Just because of the fact that we have these reactionary measures in place because of things like Islamophobia, right? These types of things are not actually going to be good. They're not actually going to create liberal change, which I'll get to later on. But the other problem with this is that it's just going to be based on suppressing these minority rights even more, right? That's actually particularly problematic and is just going to be exacerbated on their side of the house because they literally tell you that they have the majority vote on this, right? Even if it is a generation, right? And this is what closing government tries to collapse in on, right? They talk about how there's a right to each generation to define itself. But the problem is that you're, again, defining them by their reactionary choices based on fear. You can look to the fact that those reactionary choices in the US used to be completely racially biased, right? They used to be the types of problematic things that would have people, as opening government tries to come up here and talk about 3/5 of an individual, right? The only types of things that actually enacted those changes, as my partner points out, are these social movements that actually were
were created through grassroots organizations. These are the types of people who push for change in an organic way that were then able to change the Constitution, as well as just change the entrenched norms that they talk about being so important. Because as we point out to you, they're not actually changing the norms, they're just changing certain parts of the Constitution that are actually just further entrenching those norms. But you disagree.
Look, we believe that most of the
Go, yeah,
okay.
you're talking.
We believe that most of the world is moving towards liberal values that don't reflect all constitutions. But even if the direction will be more conservative, we think that it's like in every democracy, this is also legitimate. A human rights like banning or torturing minorities is simply not in the debate, rather the discourse about values.
Yeah, it is about the values, right? But as we've told you, those values are almost always reactionary from the generation, as my partner gives you a lot of analysis on. They are based on fear, they are based on the majority's idea of these small minority groups being otherized, right? But the problem as well is the fact that she says that, like, no, it's about helping these groups, but you can't help those groups if they are not the majority of the populace that is actually able to vote on them, right? And opening and closing opposition have given you multiple reasons throughout the round as to why that is just not the case. Sorry, I'm not going to take you yet, right? We just think that on our side of the house, we're actually able to give you the actual protections of rights of minorities. And again, opening opposition starts to talk about this, in particular harms at the fact that they're just affirming this discriminatory views, right? Which is particularly problematic because it then just hurts these people in even more within their identity, within the fact that they are now just being actively suppressed by the state, and this is now a standard that supposedly reflects the values of the nation, right? This is particularly problematic on the whole, and is not actually going to be good for any of these minorities to actually gain any type of momentum later on if they actually want to enact a type of change, right? This is not actually going to be good. But then you can also just look to the fact that what's going to happen with these minority communities is that they're actually going to have to go through grassroots change. They are not actually able to create these types of connections with people. You can look to the fact that, like, the gay rights movement in the US was able to gain traction in, like, the 70s and 80s, but the only way that they were actually able to do that was first by starting with grassroots organizations, by starting with having just people interacting with other people, and Harvey Milk saying, no, the point is to actually, like, come out, for instance, to your friends and neighbors so that they know that these people are not other, that they are not odd or weird, right? It is not based on the reactionary measures that are almost certainly going to happen on your side of the house. But the next thing that we talk about is how does society liberalize over time? Because government seems to think, again, and even with that POI, that these types of change are going to happen, and even though they seem to concede that conservative ideas are also going to happen, right? So what we talk about, right, is because, and specifically as my partner Laura tells you, is because of the broad amendments being applied over time. Like the example of Roe v. Wade actually using, like, within the court system, right, using the broad constitutional right of privacy is going to be the best way for these liberal ideas to happen, right? Because it means that there is going to be far less backlash from these ideas because it's not supposed change of values overnight, right? However, what's going to happen is it's going to be a long-term change and a better application of these broad values throughout the system, right? Because the other point that they have, right, is like there are all of these different communities that are supposedly going to get all of these very specific protections, but you can't have a billion different amendments in your Constitution, right? It's just, as Laura says, going to clog up the Constitution and make it harder for people to be able to apply it in the courts. What we rather think is to have these broad ideas of constitutional amendments which can then be applied within the courts, who actually know the context of what's going on and can actually push for this liberal change through a long-term solvency. The government sunset clause is actually just going to use these reactionary taxes and not help the minorities on the whole. I'm sorry, I don't have time to take you. So finally, how is this change going to be enacted, right? And I think that opening opposition gives you a good, start to this idea with the fact that the courts are going to be the most efficient use of these constitutional values, right? Of the values and, the liberal change that we really, really want, right? They talk about how they're more efficient, how they're faster. And then my partner gets up and talks to you about the fact that these broad-based constitutional values can then be applied in better ways, right? You can look back to the fact of Board versus Brown of Education, right? You can look to the fact that all of these things were actually applied through the courts first and then able to be enacted and create the positive liberal change throughout the long run. Because the other problem, right, is the fact that the majority vote is still going to happen and is going to be relatively based on I'm sorry, but there are just right now more voters in the US who are going to vote on semi-conservative opinions, right? They've even talked about this already. If this is actually true, then the only way to actually be able to create the types of change is to set the precedent in the courts in the long run, right? And also just finally, through
through these grassroots movements, who we specifically tell you about, who can actually gain political will, which means that you're actually able to pass and through the movements and actually get these rights to these minorities and more protections overall. For all these reasons, so proud to oppose.
Thank you, Opposition Whip. So, 15 minutes plus communication for freedom. Please go reasonable distance away from the room so we can't even kind of talk.
Well done. Thank you. Good debate. It's great debate.
Good debate, thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Good face, thank you.
I'm so sorry. I thought it was
Thank you.
freezing.
Thank you.
I know.
Thank you. Well done, thank you.
Bye. Good debate. Thanks.
Marco. Are we finished now?